It's good to be here with you again today. Maybe you recognize this image. This is an image that is the most reproduced image of Jesus in the entire world and in the history of Christianity. So this is Warner Sallman's Head of Christ. It was painted in 1941, and it has been reproduced on coffee mugs and calendars, and this original painting actually hangs at my alma mater in Anderson, Indiana. The Church of God purchased Warner Sallman's original paintings and had it part of their early publishing house days, and that's part of why it was so reproduced. It was kind of cutting edge at the time. Now it would be mostly kind of seen as kitschy and whatever, but at the time they were really trying to produce resources to help spread the good news about Jesus, and this was a very popular and common painting. Now, some people have, I've heard a lot of slams against it recently in the last little while, being as a very European-centric Jesus, which, to be fair, part of what happens is the images we see about Jesus do actually shape how we view Jesus. And so, Jesus has a very sort of European type of look to him in that, and so it's an interesting, depiction. And we usually think of Jesus like ourselves. And so that's a pretty natural thing for a painter who doesn't have anything to go on to think of Jesus as themselves. And if you look throughout history and art history, people have depicted Jesus in many ways. I've even seen like Rasta Jesus, like with dreadlocks and black man and all. There's all sorts of different depictions of Jesus, because if he's really the Son of God and the gospel is really for everybody, we make him more accessible, right? It's easy for us to think of Jesus like us. That's usually the case. But I have a picture that I wanted to put up that's a little bit different. And this was done by forensic scientists. So they had the permission to, they were in Israel, and they were able to study the bones of first century Jews. They were given permission to do that. So they scanned them, the skulls, the bones, and just like, CSI, crime science, but they recreated what an average Middle Eastern Jewish man from the first century would have looked like. Now, again, this is not Jesus, but this is what a first century Middle Eastern man, probably about 5 feet, maybe a little over 5 feet tall was about the average height, 5'2" or 5'4". But a much more rounded face, not the same kind of golden flowing locks of hair, a little bit different kind of a beard. And I guess my challenge would be, while you would probably, and maybe you or your grandmother had this up in your house, the question is, would you have that up in your house? Right now, I have to give credit. I was watching one of the sermons from Tim from the Bible Project, had shared a little bit along these lines, but I had similar experiences, and we learned about this guy in seminary, when I was in seminary, and some of this forensic stuff was coming out back when I was in seminary, and I nicknamed this the Shrek Jesus, because it reminded me a bit of Shrek. But the point of this is to say, the way that we envision Jesus shapes how we think about Jesus. It shapes sort of our preconceptions. This is more accurate. This is way more close to being accurate than this. Now, there's no halo or the lighting isn't, again, artistic rendition, but so is this, but with forensic science. The point that I'm making is that the way that we view Jesus or think about Jesus in our mind affects how we think about what he said and what he did. And so when we have the ideas of Jesus like this, it might lead us to some different conclusions than if we thought of Jesus like that. right? Now, this is a bit hypothetical, but we're coming to a story that I want to talk about today in our text, and I skipped over it last week. It's in Luke chapter 24, and this is the story of the walk to Emmaus, or the road to Emmaus. Luke 24, and it starts at verse 13. So I'm going to read it for you. I have the NRSV. So the resurrection had happened. The women had gone to the tomb and found it empty. They'd come back and told the disciples. They didn't really believe them. Some of the disciples went to check it out, and then that's kind of where it leaves. And now we're here. And it says, that same day, the same day of the resurrection, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus. Now we'll come back to the name of the village later and what that represents. It was about 7 miles or 11 kilometers from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about everything that had happened. While they were talking and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. But they were kept from recognizing him. Okay, so hold on a sec here. In verse 16, the NIV says they were kept from recognizing him. But other versions would say, it a little more accurately say, but their eyes were kept from recognizing it. So it's a little more specific. So let's go on. Number 17. And he said to them, what are you discussing together as you walk along? They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days? What things, he asked. About Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people, and the chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. So again, I'll pause just there as well. There's a bit of a question about who are these two people? Well, it names one of them as Cleopas. Now, in another part in John, if you were to flip over to the John chapter, I think it's 19, you find at the foot of the cross, there's a number of Marys. Everybody seemed to be named Mary at that time. One of the Marys was the wife of Clopas. Now, it didn't have the E in John's version, it just said Clopas. But most scholars would agree and think that it's the same person. Cleopas or Clopas is the same guy. So it's pretty reasonable to think that these two people would be the husband and wife, Mary and Cleopas, walking along, heading to Emmaus. Now, the interesting thing here is this word redeem. And again, just a nod to Tim from Bible Project, who I gleaned the idea from, but he pointed out that the first time in the Bible that it talks about redeem, talks about it in the Exodus, when Moses is leading the people out of Egypt, the idea of being redeemed from slavery. It was a very physical, literal redemption. It was freeing them from slavery. And when that happened, there was a very decisive public victory. There's even other places in the Bible where it talks about, in essence, God was making an example out of Pharaoh so that God's name would be lifted up. And so Pharaoh, with all of his stubbornness and all of the plagues, and then this victory, and then even the military victory through the Red Sea, God really came through and delivered his people from Egypt. He freed them from slavery. He redeemed them. Okay, so that's when the term redeem is first used in the Bible. Then when you come to what happened at the Last Supper, Jesus and his disciples are celebrating the Passover, which celebrates what event? The Exodus. The celebration of Passover is the reminder every year we cannot forget what God did for us, for our people, that God set our people free. And so we celebrate the Passover, where the blood of the lamb is spread on the doorpost and over the door, because that's what happened in the very first Passover. They ate unleavened bread, they spread the blood on the doorpost, and the angel of death passed over the Hebrew camp, the Hebrew houses. So their firstborn did not die. So Jesus is celebrating this ancient victory of God, this ancient story of redemption. Jesus celebrated that at the Last Supper just a couple of days earlier with these people. Now, the next part is to look at Emmaus. Another interesting piece here, that Emmaus, as a village, there's a couple of places that it's speculated about where it might geographically be, but there was a tale. There was a famous story of the Battle of Emmaus. Just like there's different battles in history that you would be able to recite. You know, Napoleon had certain famous battles, or the crossing of the Rubicon, or we have all these like famous battles through history. Or even in the States, you'd have, Gettysburg, or you'd have certain images, maybe the Plains of Abraham, if any of you remember Canadian history. But there's things where when you say that, the people who are from that area would know what that means. And so Emmaus was one of these places that the Jews would have known the Battle of Emmaus. Everybody knows the Battle of Emmaus. You don't have to tell anybody about that. But it was something that's actually referred to in the Catholic Bibles that have the Apocrypha. There's the books of Maccabees. And so there is a man named Judas Maccabee, the Hammer, was his, not a bad nickname for a military commander. He was the leader of a rebellion, the Hammer, Judas Maccabeus. And there was a famous battle that he led at Emmaus, where they were outnumbered and outgunned and outnumbered, and he led them by night versus the Seleucid army, and they were able to overtake through God's power and a victory that God delivered to Judas the Hammer, and they overcame these people who were coming against the people of God. And so even the idea of having Emmaus wrapped up in this story too. So you kind of have these images of two military victories, of like, when we think about redemption and when we think about what God does, we know how God works, right? The Exodus. We celebrate it every year. We make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem every year to celebrate Passover. It's such a key part of the Jewish calendar. And we all know about how God delivered our people at the Battle of Emmaus with Judas the Hammer. We know how God works. They talked to this stranger that we know as Jesus. They said, what rock are you living under? Don't you know what's been going on in the last few days? This was the most public thing that happened in the last few days, and didn't you hear about it? And then he says, what things? Again, I'm just popping back to verse 19. They replied, the things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word. Okay, so Cleopas and Mary, they recognized Jesus was a prophet. There was no doubt. He was he was powerful in word and in deed, both before God and all the people. They saw what Jesus was, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. And they say in verse 21, but we had hoped that he was the one. We had hoped he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. We know what redeem means. Redeem means come in and kick butt. Redeem means get those stinking Romans out of our territory. Right? Because Rome was the Egypt of that day. Egypt in Moses' day was Egypt. And God freed the Israelites from Egypt. Now God was going to free the Israelites from Rome, to redeem them. And we had hoped he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it's now the third day since these things took place. we saw he was mighty in word and deed, and we had hoped he might have been the one to redeem Israel. But clearly that's not the case, because we're 3 days on and he's dead. That's not what happens to the Messiah. That's not what happens to the one, the chosen one. So they're very disheartened. And they're going home. We came, we were part of a movement, we were part of these disciples, we were in, we saw what Jesus did, and now, well, boy, talk about a letdown. Moreover, some of the women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning. And when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus. He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus explained to these two people, as they walked along these 7 miles, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. And so they didn't see it, right? Part of it is who they saw Jesus as. They had an image in their head of who Jesus was. This is what Jesus looks like. This is what Jesus is going to do. When God redeems Israel, it's going to be like this. And yet they're standing there, walking with the resurrected Jesus in the flesh, resurrected flesh, and they don't recognize him. They think he's a bit dull because he apparently doesn't know what's going on. And they've confessed, like kind of in a risky way even, because you don't know who this is. They've confessed, we were followers, and our hopes have been dashed. And then this strange man, kind of criticizes them and says, "How foolish you are, and how slow of heart." Isn't that interesting? Slow of heart. To believe all that the prophets have declared. Now, if you were to ask them, they said, "No, we did believe what the prophets declared. We thought Jesus was going to redeem Israel, just like he did with Moses in the Exodus, just like he did at our hometown of Emmaus through Judas the Hammer. We thought he was going to redeem Israel." But he says, "Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" See, Jesus had a whole different way of doing things. So different that it actually was not understood, even by his disciples, even by the disciples that he spent time explaining it to. I'm going to have to suffer. I'm going to be arrested. I'm going to be suffering and tortured, and I'm going to die. Okay, what happened? Oh, right, he did say something about being arrested and suffering and dying. They didn't get it. Even when Jesus told them multiple times what was going to happen, they couldn't see it. They could not see it because the preconceived idea in their head was so strong of who they thought Jesus was and how they thought he was going to work, they didn't get it. So in one sense, the resurrection needed to happen not only as evidence and proof, but like to come back and be like, "Okay, boys, I'm back. Like I said, here's what it means. Here's what we're doing. Okay, the whole thing isn't over. I'm alive." And when you think about the evidence, Jesus did so many things that could be verified to help them believe. Even when you think about it, and I was watching an interview with Tim Keller, and there's this pondering of like, why was the stone rolled away? Why was the stone rolled away? Because remember, within a chapter or so, we find Jesus walking through a door, like appearing in rooms, walking through walls or doors, like he can appear wherever he wants. So clearly a door or a wall or a stone is not going to keep Jesus from getting to where he wants to be now that he's resurrected. So why was this stone rolled away? Well, it wasn't because Jesus was, hey, let me out of here. If only there was a couple of angels to move this thing, you know. He could have just gone right through. So the stone was rolled away, again, to help reinforce what had happened. So that the disciples could come, the women could come, and then the other disciples could come and see and look in. It's empty. There's the clothes, the wrappings. They're still there. So Jesus is the one to bring the explanation to Cleopas and Mary as they're walking along. He explains, he begins with Moses and the law. Isn't it interesting, too, to say he began with Moses? Because this is part of where the misunderstanding starts, right? Back at the Exodus, like God did that. God delivered, redeemed his people in the Exodus with Moses militarily. But Moses and the law and the prophets actually all point to Jesus, who did it a very different way. And that's what he's trying to help them get their heads around. That, look, God is not coming to beat up the Romans. He's flipped the thing on its head, and actually by suffering and dying at the hands of the enemy, he has actually won the victory. So let's keep going here. Verse 28. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread and gave thanks. He broke it and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened. Remember what happened at the beginning in verse 16? I said their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And now that he's broken the bread, their eyes are opened. And they recognized him. They recognized who he was. Now, the other interesting fact is that Cleopas and Mary were not at the Last Supper. Right? That was only the 12. So the imagery that, like, we draw that line between the Last Supper, Jesus breaking bread, but it was bigger than that. Because they weren't at the dinner, in all likelihood, right? It was just the 12. But seeing Jesus break the bread and knowing what had happened, and they'd been around 3 days, so they'd heard of what happened with the other disciples, the bigger group. But breaking the bread, and their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And then it's a bit funny because he disappeared. And then, let's go on, they asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and he opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and they returned at once to Jerusalem. So this is another interesting part. It's easy to miss. So they had walked the 7 miles down to Emmaus, and they said, they said, "Hey, stranger, stay with us because the day is getting late. The hour is late. Don't keep going. Stay with us." Okay. Then this all happens. They're having a meal. They're eating supper. And then when they realize that it was Jesus, they're like, "We got to get back to Jerusalem." So they walk the 11 kilometers back to Jerusalem right then. They go back even as it's getting dark. There they found the 11 and those assembled with them and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and appeared to Simon." Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. So they come back to Jerusalem. They gather with the other disciples. The other disciples are like, "Hey, it's true. We've seen Jesus. He's appeared to Simon Peter." And they're like, "Not only Simon Peter, let me tell you what happened as we were walking home. We were just on our way home." And they tell them the story. This is what happened on the road. And we didn't even know who it was until we sat down and broke bread. here's a couple of points. Jesus' death and resurrection is what gives proper meaning to the Scriptures. Everything in the Scriptures needs to be seen in the light of Jesus' death and resurrection. And so as we learn more about God and as we learn more about the Scriptures, we need to filter it through and understand that this is what Jesus did to Cleopas and Mary. He explained to them, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the Scriptures. So if we're going to understand the Scriptures, we actually need Jesus to help us understand them. We forget that sometimes. I forget that sometimes. We need Jesus to help us understand the Scriptures, Old and New Testament. So that's number one. Number two, it is possible to be with Jesus and not recognize him or his work because of our own preconceived ideas. This is a bit of a warning for us as well. Look, I know how God works, thank you very much, and it's not like that. And it might be Jesus standing right there. Cleopas and Mary are like, we had hoped he was the one. There was no doubt he was a great man. He was mighty in word and in deed. We hoped he might be the one to redeem Israel, but clearly he wasn't. Ain't that right, stranger? Like, isn't it, it's something just to be like, wow, how humbling would that have been? Like, think about it, if that was you and your spouse, and you just had this 7-mile walk, it all clicks. You mean, like, we were with him. How is it we didn't see him? How did we not know it was him? And so, I want us to hold this because it's really important. Part of why the meek shall inherit the earth, part of why God values humility, right? God brings low the proud and raises up the humble. Because if we're proud, we're going to miss him. We're going to miss Jesus. If we think we know everything, how he's going to work and what it's going to be. And part of this is where we're going to go in the next few weeks. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the resurrection. Not just Jesus' resurrection, but what happens? What is this resurrection that happens to us? What happens when we die? How does God talk about that? And what we're going to find is that I would dare say some of the things that we believe about what's going to happen when we die are actually not really well based in the Bible. And when we dig into the Scriptures, you're going to be challenged. And I want to lay the groundwork by saying, remember, it's possible to be with Jesus and actually miss what he's saying and miss what he's doing because we think we already know. That we would have eyes to see and ears to hear what is true and what God is really going to bring out for us. And I think as we do that and as we do dig in, I think that the depth of encouragement and the hope that we find is better than maybe the hope you think you have already. That there's actually a greater hope, a deeper hope, a more beautiful truth of what lies in store. My goal is to invite you in, actually, to be prayerfully preparing for it and to say, God, Jesus, teach me. As you go through your week, as you do your quiet time or as you read the Scriptures or even as you sing songs, to be, Jesus, give me discernment. Teach me what it is you want me to see. And Lord, help me to not miss you. Help me to not miss you. Who you are or what you're doing, because I already think I know. May I not miss out on that. Because actually, I'm willing to let go of what I think I know and what I think you're doing to be able to know and embrace what you really are doing and to pursue that. Because we know that the Spirit of the Lord is the Spirit of truth. And we want to learn and walk in that in even deeper and greater ways.